Hi class, in the last lesson that you did, you learned about how we're going to learn the content in the US and the Utah history from this last unit. And you learned that we're going to learn that by looking at the pop culture of each of the decades of the 1900s. Now, you also learned that we're not going to start with the 1910s. I wish we could do the 1910s and the 1920s. We're going to jump right into the 1930s and go up until the 1960s. But we do that because there's not a lot of time left in the last unit and we're trying to do as much as we can. And we're trying to do the decades where the most happened with Utah history as well, so we can cover that too. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our lesson objectives for today's lessons. We have our I can statements. I can define the Great Depression, and I can understand the causes of the Great Depression. That's what we're talking about today. So today we're starting the 1930s, and just like you saw in the lesson objectives, we're going to be talking about the main event of the 1930s, which was called the Great Depression. Now, when students often see that word depression, they think, oh, that just means a lot of people were sad. And I mean, kind of, and it's a little ironic that the word depression is used here, but it doesn't actually mean when people are sad. The word depression in this case is an economic term. It just means a time when there's a financial crisis in our nation. Everyone's going to be affected by this kind of a financial crisis. So we're going to talk about what happened, why it happened, and some of the effects of the Great Depression on the people. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. So let's get a general definition of what the Great Depression was. During the Great Depression, it was a time of great poverty and unemployment in the United States of America. Now, the word poverty is just synonymous with poor. It just means your average person can afford these kinds of things. And if there's a lot of poverty, it means your average person in America cannot afford those kinds of things. These could be really necessary things for life. It's not just your wants, but also your needs as well. Now, unemployment, of course, is just not being able to have a job, like being fired or let off, or for some other reason you don't have a job and then you can't find another one. Now, the Great Depression lasted 10 years, a whole decade in our country where people were struggling with both of those huge deals, poverty and unemployment. It lasted from 1929 to 1939. Now, let's get some statistics on unemployment in America during this time. During the Great Depression, 1/4 of the American population was unemployed. So that's like if you take 100 people, that would have been 25% of them, or just 25 people, were unemployed. Now, I do want to bring this into perspective for you because during this last year with COVID, we've had a lot of the same kinds of issues in our nation. We didn't have a depression. We haven't been really close to a depression, but we have had a lot of poverty and a lot of unemployment. In May, when things were really bad, when COVID first started, I read some statistics that were saying unemployment was as high as 16%. So that's just a little bit over half of what unemployment was like during the Great Depression, and this lasted for a whole decade. So we do know what things were like kind of during that time because of COVID, but they weren't nearly as bad as during the 1930s with the Great Depression. Now what we're going to do is we need to get 3 of the reasons why the Great Depression happened in the first place. What caused this to happen? Well, the biggest reason, and the one that kind of started the Great Depression happening, was when the stock market crashed in the year 1929. That was the big catalyst for the Great Depression to then happen. So, what is the stock market and how does it work? Well, let's talk about that. In the stock market, it's a way that companies and people that invest in companies can make money. So sometimes when a company is starting out, it doesn't have enough money to be able to do what it wants to do. So let's say that I want to make a cheese factory, and it's going to be called the Cheesiest Cheese Factory. And what I would do is I could ask people to invest in my company on the stock market. Or if I don't need money, I can also do that as well. But let's say I just need money. Let's say I need money to buy a cow. And let's say that 2 people invest in my company. What they do is investing means they give me their money. Well, now I can buy my cows because I have that person's money. And because they've given me their money in the form of what's called a share, they've bought a part of my company. And that means that kind of they're like a little bit of the owners of the company as well. And so because they're the owners of the company and they've invested their money into my company, then what happens is if I make a lot of money, they do as well. So let's say both of them gave me $500. And then let's say that my company is doing great and I have my cows and they're producing lots of milk and now I can have my cheese factory. let's say that my company's doing so great, I can give them $10 per week because of their share. Well, what that would mean is over time, they're earning more than that $500 that they invested in my company. And let's say my company's doing really good. And let's say that I can give them $50 per week because of how they've invested in my company. And they're earning way more than that $500. So that would be good for them. Now, there's also buying and selling of shares. That's a part of the stock market, but we won't really talk about that. But let's talk about if my company is doing really bad. So let's say nobody likes my cheese and they don't want to invest in my company is doing horrible and nobody wants to buy my cheese. Well, my investors are going to lose money. I'm losing money in my business, but they're going to lose money as well, because what they're going to do is if they've spent $500 in my company and my shares are not doing well and my company's not doing well, then what they're going to do is they're going to want to sell their share, or if they hold on to it, they just don't know if it's going to actually produce money. So if they sell their share, the chances are people are not going to want to buy that for $500. Let's say somebody buys their share for $300. Well, then they've lost $200 of their investment. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that kind of gives you a good idea that if they've invested in my company and bought a share of my company, then they get money back if my company is doing well. And if my company is doing bad, they're losing money. It's not like I'm going into their bank account and taking their money, losing money, but they're not able to get back any money, and then they have to sell, and they sell for less than what it was that they originally made. So that's kind of how the stock market works. Now, what happened during this time is a lot of financial experts were saying, you need to go to the stock market and you guys all need to buy in it because the stock market's doing great, it's going to be awesome, so you need to go buy all the shares that you possibly can buy. This is a picture of a newspaper from that time period. Right before the stock market crashed, this was what the newspapers were printing. So you can see it says stock market invincible, buy, 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 experts advise. And then you can see that on the side here on the left, it says Wall Street spirits soaring. And it has a picture of happy people. Well, a lot of financial experts were saying, go buy in the stock market. And it's a little bit more complicated than this, but people were making really bad decisions financially. People were buying too much and they were buying too recklessly, and they weren't being smart with it. They were listening to these experts who didn't really know what they were talking about, and the mix of all these financial decisions together created a stock market crash, which meant that the value of those shares went way, way down. And so the companies and the investors all lost a ton of money, and this is way worse than we can imagine. That usually happens with the stock market. And so because of that stock market crashing, it created a lot of ripple effects for the whole nation. Because what do companies do when they lose their business? Well, what they start doing is they can start to sell their products at a different price and lose money that way. And then what they start doing with their workers is they start paying their workers less. They don't give raises, they don't give promotions, and then they even let people go. They even fire people because they say, well, we're downsizing. We can't afford to have your position anymore because then we won't have to pay your wage. And so then if all the companies are firing people and then none of the companies are hiring, that's what causes these huge periods of unemployment. And so people didn't know what to do. They weren't getting as much money as they used to from their jobs, and then sometimes they just didn't have their job. So and this was way worse poverty than just like they're just not going to get as many Christmas presents for their kids in December. And that can be a tragedy, but also we're talking like they don't know where their next meal is coming from. They don't know if they can stay in their house because they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their mortgage, and the bank might foreclose on their house, and so they don't know what they're going to do. Nowadays, it could be like bills are going to be turned, they can't pay their bills, and their utilities are going to be turned off, like they can't pay for their electric bill, they're running water. And so this is the kind of poverty that we're talking about, where it wasn't just their wants, but it was also their needs that were lacking. So then this is a picture of a newspaper that you can see that happened right after the stock market crash. So remember the one before was like, oh yeah, Wall Street's doing awesome. And oh, by the way, Wall Street is where the stock market is. That's where all the financial experts that work on the stock market are. And so this one, the headline says Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. And so this is just right after the stock market. So like just a couple months earlier, they were saying buy all your stocks, everything's great. And now they're saying things are really tragic. Now, the second thing that happened at the same time was something called the Dust Bowl. Usually students are familiar with what the Dust Bowl is, but in case you aren't, let me tell you. Now, the Dust Bowl happened in the Midwest. The Midwest is really famous for farming. That's how they get their money. There's a lot of rain in the Midwest, there's good soil, so there's a lot of farmers that do a lot of farming for a way to get their income. And what happened was there was a huge drought in this decade, and the drought killed all of the crops. So the farmers lost their income. But not only did the drought kill their crops, but it killed all the other plant life as well. So it killed the grass, it killed the trees, and then there were really strong winds that came through the Midwest. And then because all the earth was really loose and all the plants were dead, their roots couldn't hold the dirt down, the dirt became really loose and would like fly around in these huge dust storms. Now we're not talking like, oh, it was a little dusty outside. These were like such bad dust storms that you couldn't see in front of you, and it would knock down windows and knock down actual like houses and things like that. And so people had to go out wearing a mask because they couldn't get the dust in their lungs. I mean, imagine that, wearing a mask when you had to go outside. I just can't even wrap my mind around that. All right. Now that was happening in the Midwest. This was called the Dust Bowl, and because of the Dust Bowl, a lot of farmers had to move out of the Midwest to look for other work and other ways to earn money because they kind of just gave up on farming. Now the third thing that happened was something called runs on the banks. A lot of the banks in the nation were failing, and this was kind of a little bit of one of the ripple effects we're talking about. Well, let's talk about how banks work so this kind of makes sense to you. Now, people bring their money to a bank for several different reasons. They bring their money to a bank because they feel like the bank is going to protect their money and secure their money. During this time period, people weren't super trustful of banks, but banks were kind of starting to get a lot of more trust during this time. And so people would be like, well, I'll take my money to the bank so the bank can hold it and have it secure rather than putting my money under my mattress or in a hole in my backyard. Because I mean, imagine if your house burnt down and your mattress is a goner, well, there goes all your money that you saved underneath it. Or if someone saw you digging that hole in your backyard and you were robbed, well, there goes your life savings. But banks can secure your money for you and protect that. Now, banks also give you interest. That if you bring your money to a bank, then you can earn a couple cents or however high the interest rate is back on your amount of money. So let's say you put $1,000 in the bank, well, you could earn 1 cent a month or something, 1 cent a week or something like that in order for having your money in that bank. And that's kind of the reward that banks give you to incentivize you to come and put your money in the bank. Well, during the night, okay, so then the other thing about banks is if you give your money to a bank, do the banks just take your money and then just go in a back room and lock it in a room and never touch it until you come back for it? Well, that's not the case. Banks use your money as loans to other people. So let's say that my cheese factory didn't work out in my example and I wanted to create a bank. Well, a bank is kind of like a business like we talked about, right? So I would have people come and put their money in my bank. Let's say I have 5 people come and each put $100 in my bank. So total, I have $500 in my bank account. And let's say one other person comes to my bank and says, well, I'd like a loan. I'd like to buy a tractor for $300. And I say, okay, well, here's $300. At this point, I have $200 left in my bank. And then what I would do is I would say, okay, well, once you buy your tractor, you have a year to pay back that loan. And let's say that I say, okay, well, and you're going to have to pay me interest in the form of $60 over the next year. So after the year passes, you need to pay me the $300 back plus 60. So now I've made money because of that loan, and I can afford to keep my business or my bank running at this point. Well, what would happen is, let's say that I gave that $300 away, but then let's say my other 5 clients that I had put their $100 each into my account or into my bank came back to my bank and said, can I have my $100 back? Could I give it to them? Well, I could give it to maybe the first 2, but then I'm out of money at that point. So what do I do with the next 3 people that say they want their money? well, maybe I could negotiate with the first two people and say, would you like just $50 back? Are you okay with that? And at another point, like a year from now, just come and get your other 50 and I promise I'll have it. Maybe they would be okay with that and I can make my bank stretch out a little longer. But if they said, no way, there's no way that I'm waiting, I need my money right now, my bank is done because I've already given their money away in the form of a loan. So I can't give them their money back, and I would have to say my bank failed, and I would have to declare bankruptcy for my bank. Well, this is what was happening. If a lot of people at the same time come to a bank and say, I want my money, and the bank is in danger of losing all the money and going bankrupt, this is called a run on a bank. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, which is a great Christmas movie, I highly recommend it. This is what was happening in the bank and why the main character was so worried about people coming and getting their money out. So like this could happen today. If everybody at the America First Bank went to the bank and said, I need all my money right now, the bank couldn't do that because the bank doesn't have their money because they've given it out as loans. Now, if one person goes to the bank and says, can I have all my money? The bank can say, well, of course, they have that money. They weren't stupid with the loans. But if everybody came at once, there's no way they could do that. And this was what was happening during the 1930s. Everybody was coming at one time to get all their money out of the banks. People started getting so scared about their money in the bank because of the Wall Street or because of the stock market crashing, and because people were so worried about their jobs and their sources of income, they were saying, you know, I just don't trust the banks. I want my money right now, and I don't really think the banks will be able to give me my money back, and I just need to go. And so what would happen is there would be like a rumor going around like, okay, today at 12 o'clock, everyone's going to go down to the bank down the street and get their money out. You got to go get your money before it's gone. And so like there would be huge lines of people waiting outside banks to get in and to get their money, and that would cause this huge crisis for the bank. So this was happening throughout the nation. So we have three things that happened. The stock market crashed. That's the main thing that happened. We have the Dust Bowl in the Midwest with the drought and the farmers losing their income and having to move. Then we have all these runs on banks and businesses failing, and this created this huge time of poverty and unemployment in our nation. It's never been that bad as bad as it has been during the Great Depression. We've had some other recessions that were pretty bad, where people were losing money. Right now is not a very good economic time for our country because of COVID, but it's never been as bad as the Great Depression. Well, all these people, they went to the president and they said, okay, president, we need your help. And the president at that time was President Hoover. And he said, instead of saying, okay, well, what can I do? Here's all these things we can do, all these programs, and here's money and stuff. He said, okay, well, I hear you, but let's just wait this thing out. And so, and that's actually something that could have worked. He was thinking that the economy would right itself if enough time passed. And he was correct about that. It was just that people needed their money and they needed some kind of help right then. So it would have worked. The Great Depression would have ended eventually, because that's kind of what happens is economies kind of repair themselves if they go through a huge crisis like this. But it wasn't fast enough for the American people. And what he was saying is, he was saying, okay, let's wait. And then he would go tell people, don't worry, guys, everything's great. But he would tell this to the people that had just lost their jobs and couldn't feed their families. So he's saying, don't worry, guys, everything's great. Just wait and things will be great. And then everyone's saying, well, no, it's not great. I just lost my job. What are you talking about? So everyone was super upset and blamed him for the Great Depression, because they said, well, you're doing nothing. And he was kind of knowingly doing nothing. It wasn't like he was a bad guy that didn't understand what they were going through, but he chose to say, don't worry, guys, don't panic, because then he thought it would make it worse. But that really just kind of blew up in his face. So everybody was super mad at the president. They were even so mad they would kind of make fun of him and name things after him. So sometimes the people that were evicted, they had to go live in like these little shacks, and there would be like villages of these little shacks that were made of like cardboard and planks of wood all around America. And they would name these villages after Hoover. They called them Hoovervilles after him. And they were like, look, this is named after you, this great place where we now live because you did nothing. And so really Hoover's gone down in history as the president that did nothing to repair the Great Depression. Now, and this is a really sad thing, the last thing I'm going to tell you about this is that during the 1930s, suicide rates rose. This was a really terrible time in American history, and you can look at the statistics at this time, and the suicide rates did go up. So people were in crisis mode, and things were pretty sad and pretty depressing during the Great Depression. So what I have for you is there's a lot of different pictures from this time period of people that really show you what this time was like. So what your assignment is, and you're going to see this on Canvas, you're going to go to where it says Great Depression photos, and there's 10 photos that I want you to look over, and there's a couple questions for each of the photos. These are real photos taken during the 1930s, so they're from that time period. They're like in historical archives. You can find them today, but they really give you a good sense of like how the general population was feeling, and it really creates a lot of feeling when you look at these, a lot of emotion as you look at how people were living. And so I have some questions I want you to answer for your assignment for this, and that'll give you a good look into what your average person's life was like during the Great Depression. And so what we're going to do is I want you to finish that assignment for today, and then in our next lesson we're going to learn about the pop culture of the 1930s. So how does the pop culture of the 1930s relate with the Great Depression? We'll look at that tomorrow.